Yeah. Justin, do you think people inside the Liberal tent could make this very difficult for the Prime Minister?
Yes, but I don't think it's going to be the people you think it is. I'm told that Gregor Robertson joined a caucus call this week, basically made clear he was extremely unhappy with the final deal with Danielle Smith, and basically said, don't call me tomorrow, I'm not going to be available.
The Liberals want Canadians to believe that Canada is on the verge of becoming an energy superpower. But something strange has been happening on CBC. Instead of cheerleading Mark Carney, their own panelists openly admit that this government is weakening climate policy, struggling to attract investment, and reacting to growing pressure from all sides. Did CBC accidentally do their job? Let's take a look.
I'm going to start with Aaron, even though we've talked about this deal in the newsroom 16 times together. But I'll start with you, Aaron, in terms of what that announcement on Friday told you about the Prime Minister's level of ambition and his approach to energy and climate.
Well, I think he made some pretty big compromises in terms of policy on the climate front. I think the government's argument, and you heard it a bit in the clip you played from Dominic LeBlanc, is that they now have greater policy certainty as compared to what was left behind by the Trudeau government. And you can definitely argue that the Trudeau government's policy was stronger on paper, but that this one, has a bit of a better chance of standing the test of time because it now is backed up by political consensus and agreement from Alberta. It is, though, at the end of the day, a weaker climate policy, and that makes it harder to see how you get to net zero. And so I think, I think it's good for the Prime Minister to have shown that he can work with Alberta. We can't ignore where the discussion in Alberta is going and the possibility of a referendum. But, that aside, he's, I think, now got a significant responsibility to explain how this country is on a credible path to net zero, because it's no longer quite obvious what that looks like.
Our stance on net zero, our stance on, taxing an economy into oblivion in order to try to solve the world's climate crisis, allegedly, by removing our 1.6% of emissions. But let's just put that to the side. The point is that there's a bunch of people that voted for these Liberals, and there's a bunch of people out there in the media that do subscribe to this policy. And you're hearing them on CBC, not just talking to Rosemary, but talking to other voters. This is significant because this isn't conservatives coming at Mark Carney about not implementing conservative policies. This is progressives coming at Mark Carney and coming on CBC and actively talking about the fact that Mark Carney is not doing what they thought he was going to do. They thought, from their perspective, he was going to be Mr. Net Zero, and he was going to come in and be just as fanatical, if not worse, than Justin Trudeau. Well, from their perspective, he's not doing that. And that's a problem. And that's not going to be a problem like overnight, where you're going to see this this landslide of support erode away from Mark Carney. But this is going to be almost like a waterboarding type of an erosion of support. You're going to feel a couple of drips initially. You're not even going to pay attention to it. But over time, as that keeps dripping, every drip is going to be more of a resounding, let's just say, drop of the ocean that's actually going to feel like thousands of gallons of water hitting your face at one time, the more this goes. And the progressives have a real shot of eroding away from the Liberals and moving over to the NDP. Some of the news media was actually talking about Avi Lewis a couple of weeks ago, and they said maybe Avi Lewis and his extreme progressivism, that could actually be the answer to Mark Carney. And it's not meaning to say that Avi Lewis is going to be the Prime Minister of Canada, far from it. But what it could do is completely take away all of these progressives that are waiting for Mr. Environment, Mr. Carney, to fix the climate crisis in the world, not just Canada. And you hear these terms like net zero openly talked about on CBC. So if they feel that he's not actually practicing what he's preaching, that's going to be a problem for him. And it's going to be a problem that mounts over time. So this is interesting to see this beginning.
Yeah. Justin, do you think people inside the Liberal tent could make this very difficult for the Prime Minister?
Yes, but I don't think it's going to be the people you think it is. So Stephen Guilbeault, for sure, resigned from cabinet to some degree in protest of the government's kind of oil and gas policies. But I'm told he's actually been pretty collaborative with Carney's office over the last couple of months. I'm told the Prime Minister's office calls him pretty frequently and he picks up, he offers advice. He's not been the thorn in their side that maybe we were expecting him to be. Meanwhile, you have Jonathan Wilkinson, who I think was kind of angling to be that kind of grumpy Gus in Caucus about, the deprioritization of climate. He's off to Europe now, so he's gone. Here's what's interesting. So I was talking to a Caucus source last night. There's a clear need for the Liberals to have a champion in BC who can come out and actually make the case for this pipeline and sort of some of the climate deals around it. You would think that would be Gregor Robertson, kind of their biggest high-profile MP cabinet minister out on the West Coast. I'm told that Gregor Robertson joined a caucus call this week, basically made clear he was extremely unhappy with the final deal with Danielle Smith, and basically said, don't call me tomorrow, I'm not going to be available. So, and he was notoriously missing from a big LNG announcement on the West Coast as well. So you don't actually have a big champion right now. Carney does not have a lieutenant in BC who's selling this deal. I think that's very telling. On top of the fact that there's also been some kind of disgruntlement about Gregor Robertson's delivery as housing minister, you have to start to wonder, does Mark Carney need to find a new sort of lieutenant for British Columbia who can actually convince Eby and the province and his caucus that this is going to work out? Never mind the problems you have in Quebec, where there's also a number of MPs who are apart from Guilbeault who are unhappy about this. So this is a difficult political question, and Mark Carney does not love solving difficult political questions, at least for his own caucus.
So that's fascinating. So this guy works for the Toronto Star, just so everybody knows, a very liberal-friendly publication. So for him to come out and talk about that, sure, Jonathan Wilkinson wasn't happy, off you go. Gregor Robertson was not one of the Trudeau leftovers. He was one of Carney's new guys coming in that he made a minister in the cabinet. So that type of response from a person in his own cabinet saying, don't call me tomorrow, I'm not going to be available. Basically, screw you, boss. So you have people that are in BC, and we've talked about this before, where the BC caucus didn't even show up to the House of Commons at one point because they were so unhappy about this. And now you're hearing there's a lot of disgruntlement out in Quebec. So, mainstream media, let's hear more reporting on this, because all we've been hearing about is this alleged disgruntlement within the Conservative caucus. Meanwhile, it seems like from the West Coast all the way out to Quebec, you have people that are in Mark Carney's party that aren't happy with what he's doing. This is fascinating. That there's this quiet rebellion that is building within his caucus. And we talked about this before, that there's going to be this splinter of environmentalists on one side and the faith people on the other side, and then everyone who's left that's in the middle. So you're going to have this caucus splintering into 3 separate factions over time. And Mark Carney isn't a people manager. We know this. We know this based on his own resume. And when you're not a people manager, you need very good people managers around you. Who are the people managers around him? Mark Miller? Are you kidding? Patty Haidu? Give me a break. Francois Philippe Champagne? Okay, fine. So when you don't have strong people managers around you, how do you then manage an entire caucus of over 170 MPs? That's a problem. And this is what these people don't necessarily think about when it comes to this. So you have to have strong people managers to A, make people feel heard, B, make people feel involved, And C, make sure that they're aligned with the vision that you're setting out. And if you don't have that, then you need to address that, and you need to address it quickly. Otherwise, you start having this happen. And for people to be talking to reporters and talking about this drama that's going on inside, that's fascinating to hear. So this is interesting. But it gets even more interesting.
So I'm so interested in getting your perspective first on the industrial carbon price. Obviously, it's going up, but you now have a lot of predictability around it. What did you make of that industrial carbon pricing that they've agreed to?
I'd say it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is because they've reached an agreement, really the Prime Minister has pivoted Liberal policy, which for the previous 10 years hadn't been very supportive of the oil industry, to really embrace making Canada an energy superpower. And what that would lead to with embracing Premier Smith's vision of doubling oil production, so take it from about 5 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day. And to give your viewers a quick perspective on that, that's going to make close to double the GDP of Canada over 10 years. I mean, that's about 4 points to the growth rate. So it's quite transformational. So that's super positive. The sort of the challenge, or if that's the good news, kind of the bad news is the party that was not at the table to try and implement this, of course, were investors. I mean, the province was there, the federal government was there, but the investors weren't there. And so the investors were really the audience for on Friday. And if you're an investor, what you heard is a couple of things. First of all, Prime Minister Carney saying that the MOU has effectively increased the carbon price 6.5 times. That's a real attention getter. Now, of course, the Premier said, hey, it could have been a lot worse, because originally the Liberal policy was to actually increase it 8.5 times. Okay, so it depends on your cup half full or cup half empty. But of course, if you're an investor, they look at it on a global basis and relative to other places. And as some of your viewers may know, Canada is the only country of the 10 major oil producers that has an industrial carbon tax. So if you're an investor, you're sitting in New York and you're thinking, hey, do I want to give the oil industry some more money? You heard, geez, this is the only place with a carbon tax, and they just increased it 6.5 times. So that's a pretty tough message to hear, as you can appreciate. So that's kind of the first and dominant reaction on carbon pricing. Do you
think though, Adam? Sorry, do you think though that this opens up the possibility for a private proponent for a pipeline? Because it definitely was clear that there is an interest in a new pipeline, both by Premier Smith and the Prime Minister.
So again, that's very encouraging. It's nice to have a date, September 2027, to sort of get this project started. So that was definitely encouraging. Again, the challenge on that was it's still pretty murky about how it's going to get to the point of actual project approval. Part of the reason being is some of the legislation that is centered around, or there are hurdles, for instance, Bill C-69, the so-called No More Pipelines bill, is still in place. So if you're the private sector and you're thinking about trying to build this, say, geez, and because remember, I always said there's two challenges. One is just getting approval for a pipe, but two is to fill a 1 million barrel a day pipeline, there's going to be a lot of projects that's going to be required to be approved to be able to actually fill it. So I would say it still to be determined as to whether or not the plausibility of actually getting a pipeline filled remains to be seen.
It's just unreal that Pierre Poilievre has been saying things consistently over the last 3 years. Some would say even 10 years. And the Liberals try and swat it away. They say that, what are you talking about? It's imaginary and all this stuff. And the media doesn't cover it, and the media kind of bats it away. But now you have people coming onto mainstream media telling people about this pipeline, about C-69, which Pierre Poilievre has been saying, get it repealed. because investors are not going to come into a country where there's existing legislation in place that at the snap of a finger can kill a project. So why would they come in investing tens of billions of dollars in order to actually get a project done on a pipeline, or at least to start one, only for the possibility of the federal government to come around and kill it? That's risk management. So that's a problem. And it's also interesting that Rosemary tries to say, oh, well, isn't this going to attract investors? And the short answer is no, it's not. It's nice that you have a date, but that's all you have. You're not going to be able to attract investors with the legislative landscape that is currently existing in Canada. Now, this is a wonderful pivot because we go into something that Mark Carney said back on April 15th of this year. And he was all pompous and egotistical as he said it.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Mr. Speaker, I feel like I'm in the presence of students. And on an exam, I don't think you would pass the exam with those answers. Mr. Speaker, as the IMF confirmed yesterday, Canada will have the second fastest growth in the G7 this year. As the IMF confirmed yesterday, we have the best fiscal position in the G7. Point final. As we have confirmed, we have the highest foreign direct investment per capita in the world. Hear, hear.
Okay, so we've already talked about, the first two things in there. We don't need to go over them ad nauseum again. Canada does not have the strongest fiscal position in the world. The only reason why he's saying that is because there's the Canada pension plan over here, which he can't touch, by the way. But they're using that to try to say, look at the Canada pension plan and just consider that an asset when you're balancing that against our debt position. So when you do that, it looks like, oh, we're actually in a pretty good position. The problem is the government doesn't have access to and can't access the Canada pension plan, so it's not an asset. So they're improperly declaring it an asset when they're going to these different financial institutions trying to show them and get them to say that Canada's fiscal position is great. So that's the biggest part about that, and we've already talked about that. I want to talk about the fact that he's trying to say, oh, well, we have the highest, foreign and direct investment in the world. Really? 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 Well, what do you have to say to this, Mr. Carney? This is from the Globe and Mail, folks. Venture capital investment in Canadian growth stage firms fell to near zero in latest quarter, report says. This came out on May 13th. New venture capital investment for growth stage companies in Canada fell to near zero in the first quarter of 2026, according to a report from the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. Notice that Mark Carney doesn't talk about them. The CVCA report showed just one growth stage deal worth around $1 million in the first 3 months of the year. CVCA defines growth stage as a later step of a company's expansion where money is invested to support its scale-up. More broadly, the report showed a total of around $936 million in venture capital for all stages invested over 104 deals during the quarter. That was the smallest deal count for a quarter since 2017. Almost 10 years. Almost 10 years. So what does that mean? So that means that companies that get to kind of a mid-level stage and then they want to scale, meaning really grow and perhaps become a global presence, really scale up the amount of jobs that they'd be having in Canada. That sounds important. That's the stage that they're at. And what this report says is there was no investment from venture capitalists anywhere. And that's important because what do venture capitalists want to do? They want to make money. And when you see them investing in something, it's not always the case, but it's a good bet that it's probably going to make money because venture capitalists have to be very, very good at what they do in order to continue to make money. So when you see virtually no venture capitalists dumping money into Canada, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And it completely flies in the face against Mark Carney trying to say that Canada is the best place to invest in the world. Then why is nobody doing it, sir? Why aren't you doing it? You took your venture capital, 95% of it isn't even in Canada. So you obviously weren't betting on Canada, were you? Now, this is the problem. And this is where we go back to the beginning. What this is going to do. Because Mark Carney's trying to placate the Conservative side to retain their votes, and he's trying to placate to the Liberal side as well. And if we've learned anything from both Kamala Harris and Justin Trudeau, is that when you try to please everybody, you end up pleasing nobody. And that's what Aaron O'Toole learned the hard way when he was trying to be prime minister in his election. And that's where Pierre Poilievre and his team, they took that lesson to heart. They've been consistent. They haven't wavered. So nobody can say, well, you're flip-flopping on this and you're flip-flopping on that. They've been consistent all along. And the only thing that is going to serve to do is to prove him right. And as Canadians pay more attention to Mark Carney and watch his announcements turn into dust in the wind, all they are going to reach into their pockets and find a year from now is nothing but air.